Hey everybody, before we get into this episode of the Feel Good podcast, I want to just give you a few tips on how to make listening to these more efficient, because they are a bit lengthy. First, you can go to settings right under the video, and you can increase the speed. So you'll still hear me talking, but it'll just be going faster. Also, if you go in the description box, I'll outline different main points of the video with the time that it's at. So if you want, you can scroll through the video to get to the main points that you want to hear. And one last thing, the references at the end, they're not meant to try to make myself look like this big researcher that can stuff all these references in a presentation. The main point of them is that you look at them and you further your own knowledge by using those resources. I'm not an expert in these topics, and there are experts out there. And I want you to go through those references and dig deeper into a topic if you'd like. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Feel Good Podcast. Hey everybody, Dr. Nick here on Feel Good Friday. Today we're going about this a little bit differently. I'm going to give a little bit of a longer presentation type video here. It's going to get into some science and research, and it will be pretty nerdy at some points, but I am a science nerd at heart, so you'll just have to deal with the nerdiness as it comes. But I do think this will be helpful, and I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, let's get into the topics of the day. Today we're going to be talking about compression garments and blood flow restriction. So these are two training concepts that have gotten more and more popular as of recent. So today we're going to talk about what the techniques are, the theories behind them, some of the research out there, and then how to use them in your own training. So like I always say, if you have any pain or nagging injuries, be sure to get checked out by a healthcare practitioner. I don't want you self-diagnosing yourself or putting yourself in danger. So before starting any new training technique, be sure to run it by a healthcare practitioner first. So before we get into compression garments and blood flow restriction, it's important to have a general idea of how the heart and circulatory system work. So the main function of your blood is to carry oxygen and nutrients to the tissues of your body. So the whole cycle basically starts in the heart. So you have this oxygenated blood, right? This oxygen-rich blood in the heart. The heart gives a hard contraction, and that blood then squirts out, and it travels through your arteries down all the way to your tissues. Now, the arteries in this picture are red, and the veins are blue. So the arteries carry oxygenated blood, and the veins carry deoxygenated blood. So once that blood is pumped out of the heart, it travels out the arteries, and as you can see, the arteries are much thicker the closer you get to the heart, and as you go further and further away from the heart, they get thinner and thinner. They get so thin that once they hit the tissue level, that oxygen actually passes right through those membranes and into the tissues. So then that blood loses its oxygen and it gets picked up by the venous system, by the veins. The veins are also very, very thin down at the tissue level. So the veins pick up that deoxygenated blood and bring it back to the heart to get reoxygenated, and the process starts all over. Now it's important to remember that the velocity and the speed at which the blood is traveling is different in the arteries and the veins. In the arteries, the blood travels much, much faster than the veins. So a way to think of it is if you have a toy car and you push it across a floor, it's going to be going at its highest speed right after you push it. And as it travels, it's going to get slower and slower and slower. It's the same thing that happens to the blood throughout this whole journey. That initial pump of the heart causes that blood to shoot out into the arteries very quickly, but then by the time it goes into the veins and then works its way back up to the heart, it's not going as fast, right? The velocity isn't as high, so it's much, much slower in the veins going back to the heart. So I always like to use metaphors to help explain different functions in the body. The way that your heart and your circulatory system work is very similar to how a house is heated with a boiler and steam heat. So in this picture, you have the boiler right in the center, that orange box. Now, the water is going to be heated up in that boiler, and that steam, right, that hot water is going to pass through those pipes. Now, it's going to pass through the red pipes in this picture. So you could see that red pipe leaving the boiler to the right there, okay, with that hot water, that water carrying all that heat. That's similar to your arteries. That red pipe is similar to your arteries because your arteries carry the blood with oxygen, just like that pipe carries the water with heat. Now, once that red pipe gets to the radiator, it's like when your arteries reach your tissues. It's going to give off that heat to the room, just like the blood gives off oxygen to your tissues. Then after that water and that steam loses its heat, it's going to collect in that blue pipe and work its way back to the boiler, just like your veins pick up that deoxygenated blood and bring it back to the heart. So let's start with compression garments. So we all know what they look like. They seem to be like a trendy thing to wear in the gym, and sometimes I'm not sure if everyone who wears them actually knows their purpose or their potential purpose. So I think majority of people see someone on Instagram wearing them, they think they look cool, and they go out and buy them. They're also really comfortable, and they make for good gym selfies, I would imagine, if you would like to see your curves and your massive muscles as you're training. So they're commercially available from companies like Under Armour, Nike, Tesla, and a couple other companies. They can come in full-length tights, partial and full-length tops, knee-length stockings, and even full body suits. So you can really be like a superhero in superhero tights while you're working out. What could be better? So for those who don't wear these to be trendy, they are typically worn by runners, weightlifters, and other individuals in hopes to improve performance and recovery. So the garments are worn over the muscles being worked during or after exercise. So for example, a runner may wear knee-high compression garments in hopes to target performance and recovery of the calf muscles. So they go over the muscles that you are targeting. They're thought to function through changes in blood flow, perfusion, which just means blood flow to body tissues, and they're also thought to impact muscle swelling. They were actually first used as a medical intervention to increase blood flow to the heart, so to help that venous system like we talked about just before. Just a word on these pictures here. So these purple compression garments here all the way to the left, those are my mother's compression garments. Those are my mother's legs and her feet also, and her knees, and that bruise on her knee. I gotta just say one thing. My mom is awesome. She runs marathons. She gets up at ungodly hours of the morning and goes running just like I get up at ungodly hours and go to the gym. But she runs in snow, in rain, sleet, hail, lightning, thunder, you name it. She's out there running. So you could see that bruise on her knee. She recently fell and scraped up her elbows and her knees pretty badly. That's actually healed after a couple days. It was a lot worse when it actually happened. And this crazy woman went and finished her run, which was probably close to 10 miles that day. So that kind of explains where I get my craziness from and work ethic. But I'll tell you what, my father is no different. He has a sickening work ethic as well. when it comes to different things, which probably explains where I get my crazy work ethic issues from. Okay, rant over. Let's continue. So, blood flow restriction involves restricting the venous return of blood flow from the muscle. So the goal here is not to restrict the blood flow to the muscle, but you want to prevent that blood flow returning from the muscle. So if you think back to our little heart and circulatory lesson, that means you want to restrict venous blood flow back to the heart, but not arterial blood flow. So you want to get that blood to the muscle, but you don't want it to escape. So you want it to pool in the muscle. Now it's easy to do that because, like I said before, the blood in the arteries is going so much faster than the veins. So if you want to stop the blood flow in an artery, you really have to add some force to that strap to prevent that arterial flow because it's going so quickly. Not as much for the veins. So that's an important point. And this is why also you see in the movies when someone gets an injury and the blood is kind of squirting out and pulsing out, that means an artery was hit because it's coming out with such force. But if you just get a scrape and the blood kind of just oozes out and it doesn't squirt out, that means that you just kind of tore up a vein. That's another good way to kind of think of all this. So you want to leave the arteries open so you get all those nutrients and all that oxygen to the muscle, but then you don't want to let it leave. So this is accomplished by the use of either a blood pressure cuff or knee wraps, anything you can kind of tightly secure around the limbs. So for example, to use blood flow restriction on the arm muscles, you would tightly secure a cuff or cloth or knee wraps as close to the shoulder as possible. So this is going to restrict the blood flow returned from the arms and cause that blood to pool. And it's thought to have some benefits and improve strength and hypertrophy or muscle growth while using significantly lighter loads than conventional weight training. So how do compression garments actually work? The exact mechanism is somewhat unclear, but there are a few ideas out there as to why they are effective at enhancing recovery. First has to do with muscle swelling. So while we train, we do damage to our muscles. So we create muscle damage. This damage causes swelling. The brain senses this swelling and sends a message of fatigue. Compression can limit the swelling after training, which then is thought to reduce that signal from the brain that says fatigue, because the brain is not sensing as much swelling. The next possibility is tissue oxygen saturation. So that is how much oxygen from the blood is actually being taken up by the tissues. Now, oxygen is important to muscles because when oxygen is present, the muscles have a higher capacity to do work. When oxygen is not present, that's when we get fatigue, muscle burning, and muscle failure. So when there is adequate oxygen present for our muscles to do whatever job they're trying to do, when there's enough oxygen, that is called an aerobic environment. When there is not enough oxygen present, that's called an anaerobic environment. So, what compression garments do is that they help prolong the time it takes to go from an aerobic state to an anaerobic state. So, that's important because once we run out of that oxygen, like I said, that's when we feel that burn, and that's when fatigue and muscle failure kick in. So if we are doing a set of, say, 15 reps, the first 6 or 7 reps, we probably won't be feeling much of a burn, because as we breathe, the oxygen that we're breathing is adequate enough for our muscles to do those reps. As we keep going on through our set and we get to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 reps, now we start to feel that burn because the oxygen requirements of those muscles are now going up, and there is not enough oxygen to keep supplying these muscles. So that aerobic state now changes to an anaerobic state, and the acidity in the muscle increases, that lactic acid gets produced, and we feel that burn and fatigue and muscle failure. So, compression garments can basically prolong the time that it takes to get into that anaerobic state, therefore delaying the onset of burning and fatigue and enhancing recovery. So let's see what some of the research says about compression garments compared to no compression. So is it worth our time, basically? So its effect on muscle soreness, yes. So it may decrease soreness following exercise. Strength, it could limit the loss of strength typically seen following exercise. So after we exercise, our muscles are broken down and our strength decreases. But through recovery, we gain that strength back. So the idea is that these compression garments limit that loss of strength. Power, it may help maintain power or limit the loss of power following exercise, so similar to strength. Range of motion, it may slightly limit that loss of range of motion, typically seen following exercise, and that's going to have to do with that swelling that we talked about. So whenever you have swelling in a muscle or around a joint, it's going to restrict range of motion. So if you can limit that swelling, then you will limit the amount of range of motion that is lost at a joint. And one study looked at sprint and aerobic performance, and it showed that compression garments can preserve sprint performance and improve time trials following a simulated rugby game. So now let's talk about blood flow restriction training. So how does it work? When we train, resistance training causes muscles to release these growth factors and metabolic byproducts that may lead to hypertrophy. So things like growth hormone and lactic acid, these all get released by the muscles as a result of resistance training. And by restricting the venous return, what you're doing is you're causing that blood to pool, and you're preventing those growth factors and metabolic byproducts from being washed away. So there's more time for them to interact with their corresponding receptors. Now, the research doesn't support that initial rise in growth hormone that comes with training. It doesn't have much effect on hypertrophy, but nonetheless, this is one of the theories why blood flow restriction training promotes hypertrophy. Now, what you're also doing is you're increasing the amount of deoxygenated blood, or the venous blood, and so you're decreasing the amount of oxygenated blood. So by keeping that deoxygenated blood in the area, you're preventing more oxygen from coming in. What that does is it decreases the oxygen of the environment, which, like we said before, causes that anaerobic environment. So what you're doing is you're actually speeding up that process. So you're getting into an anaerobic environment faster than you would without restricting that blood flow. So you're causing your muscles to be starved of oxygen. That's going to cause faster and more sustained recruitment of type 2 fibers. Now, type 2 fibers are the muscle fibers that kick in once that anaerobic state is reached. Type 1 fibers are the muscles that work in an aerobic state. So, if you are running a mile, you are likely not burning at your legs because it's a comfortable pace, for the most part. It's a comfortable, fast jog, and you're breathing, so your muscles are getting enough oxygen, so you're not in an anaerobic state. So those muscles that you're using to run that mile are type 1 fibers. Now, if you sprint or if you perform a set of heavy lifting, you're going to run out of oxygen a lot quicker than a steady mile run because you're not going to be breathing as much in the amount of time that your muscles need that oxygen. So you feel that burn, and that's that anaerobic state. And you need that anaerobic state for those type 2 fibers to be tapped into, and those type 2 fibers are the ones that grow the biggest. So you are speeding up the process of going from that aerobic state to the anaerobic state, thereby increasing the amount of type 2 fibers that you are activating. You're getting to those type 2 fibers quicker. And this is typically done with significantly less weight than you would have to otherwise. So you can use 20% of your 1 rep max and still get these benefits, which is one of the key points of blood flow restriction training, is that it allows you to reap similar benefits of heavy lifting, but with a fraction of the weight, and we'll get into that more in a little bit. So is blood flow restriction any better than just conventional training? Before we get into this slide and start talking about parameters like strength and hypertrophy, we have to just talk about the design of some of these studies. So in the studies, what they do is they break up usually into, say, 2 groups. One group that performs blood flow restriction training and another group that performs traditional weight training. Now, like we said before, one of the benefits of blood flow restriction training is that you can use significantly lighter weights than conventional weight training and get similar effects. So, what the studies did was sometimes they would have what's called matched loads, and other times they would have unmatched loads. What a matched loaded study is when both groups used the same weight. So both groups trained with that light weight, more characteristic of the blood flow restriction. An unmatched study is when the blood flow restriction group used their lightweight and the traditional training group used heavier weights, typical of traditional weight training. So, for strength, blood flow restriction was shown to be similar or slightly less effective than conventional strength training with unmatched loads. So when the conventional group used heavier weight than the blood flow restriction group, they still had similar increases in strength. When the loads were matched, so when the traditional group used the same light weight as the blood flow restriction group, the blood flow restriction group saw more increases in strength. For hypertrophy, there was blood flow restriction showed similar effectiveness to conventional hypertrophy training with unmatched loads. Again, so that means that the conventional training group used heavier weight than the blood flow restriction group, and the blood flow restriction group still showed similar effectiveness in hypertrophy. Blood flow restriction was also shown to be more effective than conventional hypertrophy training when the loads were matched. Power, sprint speed, and endurance, there's really limited research at this time. So is it safe? Is blood flow restriction safe? Is tying a tight wrap around my arm to mess with my blood flow safe? Is this going to cause any problems? Is it going to, is this seems far-fetched and crazy? Is this safe? Well, seems like it is for the most part. So some contraindications, which is just a long word for a reason why you shouldn't do something. A contraindication to blood flow restriction training would be a history of a DVT, which is a deep vein thrombosis, which is a blood clot in your calf that can be quite deadly if it dislodges and goes to your heart and lungs. Pregnancy, varicose veins or other venous insufficiencies, high blood pressure, and cardiac disease. Also, it should be noted, which is quite obvious, but I think it deserves to be put in this slide. Excessive pressure and prolonged ischemia, which just means decreased blood flow, can lead to necrosis or death of tissues, which is pretty obvious if you restrict blood supply to any kind of tissue. That tissue is going to die. That is similar to a stroke. A stroke is ischemia to the brain. So a part of the brain is not getting oxygen, and so that portion of the brain dies. That happens when you restrict arterial blood flow, not venous blood flow. That is a big distinction here. So even though the blood flow restriction guidelines that we talked about don't use enough pressure to occlude those arteries, and this is not being applied for long periods of time, caution should still be taken. If you have any severe pain, dizziness, nausea, numbness, tingling, etc., you obviously should stop immediately and consult a medical professional. And again, always check with a medical professional before trying any new training tool. So before we get into some studies, I want to just take a moment to talk about research. This topic actually is going to have its own video because it's so important. But individual research studies are not the end-all, be-all. So for example, if treatment A was found to be better than treatment B in a particular study, that doesn't mean that treatment A is better than treatment B. All that means is that there was a trend found and further research needs to be done. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses are groups of individual studies put together so that a wider range of trends can kind of be put together and we can get different conclusions from them. Still, these are not the end-all, be-all, because what science and empirical studies do, and I'm going to quote Layne Norton, is that they give us averages of data points. But we as individuals are individual data points. So, say in a certain study, there was one group that lifted very heavy weight and one group that lifted very lightweight. And at the end of the day, the researchers concluded that lifting heavier weight led to greater muscle gain. That's great. But if you look deeper into the study, maybe there were 100 people that did the study, and maybe 75 of them gained muscle. But maybe there were a handful of people that actually lost muscle lifting heavy weight. Maybe there were a handful of people that gained a lot of muscle lifting lightweight. But the averages showed that heavyweight was better at gaining muscle. So this just goes to show that what research gives us are averages of individual data points. And when we go to take that information and apply it to our own training or our own lives, we have to remember that we are only individual data points. So yes, we can start with what the studies show, but always keep an open mind because you may have to adjust it to fit your individual needs. So the first study we're going to look at involves treadmill walking and blood flow restriction. What the researchers did was they had two groups. One group had 9 untrained men with blood flow restriction. The other group had 9 untrained men without blood flow restriction. Both groups performed a treadmill walking regimen 2 times a day, 6 days a week for 3 weeks, using sets of 2-minute bouts at about 1.9 miles per hour with a 1-minute rest in between. What they found was that the group using blood flow restriction increased growth hormone, thigh muscle size by 4 to 7%, and 1 rep max isometric strength by 8 to 10%. The control group showed no change in growth hormone, muscle size, or 1 rep max strength. What the researchers concluded was that you can have these benefits using blood flow restriction training using very low intensity exercise, such as treadmill walking. This could be useful in a wide range of populations, such as the elderly, who can't train very intensely. It's important to note that the study used untrained men. An untrained individual will be more likely to see gains in strength and muscle mass, no matter what kind of training they do. So it's important to keep that in mind, but nonetheless, the study was very interesting. So the next study we're going to take a look at involves blood flow restriction following ACL reconstruction surgery. Now this study was done in 2000, so the post-op ACL protocol has changed since then. In this study they had the patients immobilized for 2 weeks for the course of the study. Now, more recently, post-op ACL protocols call for movement pretty soon after the operation, but the study was still very interesting. What they did was they had 2 groups. One group had 8 patients, 4 male, 4 female. They received the usual post-op ACL protocol at the time, along with blood flow restriction. The blood flow restriction was applied for 5 rounds of 5 minutes on and 3 minutes off, 2 times a day, 9 a.m. and 2 p.m., and that was for 2 weeks. The other group had 8 patients, 4 male, 4 female, received the usual post-op ACL protocol at the time without blood flow restriction. So what they did was they just strapped a cuff around their leg but did not inflate it. The results were significantly less atrophy of the thigh muscles in the blood flow restriction group. Atrophy is just muscle wasting, so that's a big problem after an ACL surgery because you don't use the muscles quite as much. They tend to get smaller and have less bulk to them, and a big part of the rehab is to gain that muscle back. So this study showed that blood flow restriction may have an impact on the amount of atrophy seen after surgery. My question with this study would be, how does restricting that venous return from the lower extremity, how does that affect the edema that's built up around the knee? Because that's also something that the rehab after surgery deals with, is trying to get all that inflammation and edema out of that lower extremity. So my thought would be, okay, they did prevent some atrophy, but I would be interested in to see how how restricting that venous return, how that impacted swelling. The next study we're going to take a look at involved blood flow restriction following ankle immobilization. This was done in 2008. So left ankle, 15 healthy males was immobilized for 2 weeks, and they were instructed to be non-weight bearing, which means that they did not put their foot down during that 2 weeks. That foot did not touch the ground during the 2 weeks. If they had to move around or walk around, they used crutches or they hopped on their other leg, and they did not let that left ankle touch the ground. Again, these were healthy males, so they didn't have an injury. All they did was they were immobilized. And any kind of immobilization of a joint usually results in weakness and atrophy. So what they did was they divided the subjects into 3 groups. First group had used blood flow restriction for 5 minutes, followed by 3 minutes of rest, repeated for 5 rounds, 2 times a day for 2 weeks. Another group did isometric training. So they did 20 exercises for the knee flexors and extensors, so your quads and hamstrings, and ankle plantar flexors, or your calf muscles, with a 5-second isometric contraction followed by rest, 2 times a day for 2 weeks. The control group had no intervention. They just were immobilized. The results showed that the blood flow restriction group experienced less atrophy and more strength retention than all groups, and they performed no exercise. This is very interesting because it would seem that the group performing the isometric strengthening would maintain most of their strength and muscle mass, but that's not what the results showed. The results showed that blood flow restriction was such a significant intervention that they prevented atrophy and kept strength without even doing exercise. Okay, so to wrap up compression garments in a nutshell, and to provide some practical applications of how to use this. So both upper and lower body compression garments have been shown to decrease the loss of strength and power that usually comes following exercise. They can also reduce muscle soreness 24 to 48 hours following exercise, which can improve the perception of recovery. So, as an overall recovery strategy, you can wear the compression garment over the affected area for 12 to 24 hours in the 1 to 2 days following exercise. That seems to be most effective from the studies that I've seen. I think it would also help to, so say you have the compression garment on your legs, it would help to lie down and elevate your legs and maybe do some deep breathing or meditating. So you tap into that parasympathetic nervous system. That is a whole nother video, but that will enhance the recovery process. And by elevating your legs, you are further increasing that venous return back to the heart. So another interesting question is, so how tight do these things have to be? And what the research shows is that improvements in recovery have actually been displayed over a wide range of pressures. So there hasn't been, at least from the studies I've seen, there hasn't been an exact or optimal pressure to be found. Okay, so to kind of wrap up blood flow restriction and give you some practical applications, you want to wrap the most proximal area of the arms and legs. So if you're training your arms, you want to wrap as close to the shoulder as possible. And if you're training your legs, you'd want to wrap as close to the inner and upper thigh as possible. So proximal just means close to the trunk. And you want to use about 50 to 100 millimeters of mercury of pressure. So that's if you have a blood pressure cuff or some way of measuring the pressure, that's what you want to shoot for. If you don't, the research shows that you could estimate it by about 7 out of 10 tightness. You want to perform 3 to 5 sets to muscular failure with 20 to 50% of your 1 rep max, with the muscle occluded the entire time. So if your 1 rep max on the curl, on the biceps curl, is say 30 pounds, 20% of 30 pounds is 6 pounds, 50% of 30 pounds is 15 pounds. So the weight you would use would be anywhere from 6 to 15 pounds. Rest periods in between your sets should be about 30 to 60 seconds. And again, you're keeping that strap on throughout all of your sets. Even while you're resting, you're keeping the straps on. After the final set, that's when you remove the wraps and you restore blood flow to the muscle. So what's the take home with blood flow restriction and compression garments? With blood flow restriction, the goal is to induce fatigue, blood pooling, and muscle burning quicker and with less weight and work being done. This is actually the opposite of the goal of compression garments. With compression garments, the goal is to reduce that onset of fatigue, blood pooling, and burning, and it's more geared toward recovery and performance. So, if a runner used blood flow restriction, they would get to muscular fatigue and feel burning sooner. So if they're trying to minimize that burning and fatigue during a race, blood flow restriction is not for them. That's why compression garments would work better in that case. If a bodybuilder was trying to maximize the burn and pump during an exercise, using a compression garment would actually make it more difficult to achieve that. But if a bodybuilder is trying to increase performance and not necessarily only focus on the burn and the pump, then a compression garment may be good for them. And of course, no matter what the training, compression garments can be beneficial following the exercise to help enhance recovery. Okay, so like I said in the intro, I'm by no means an expert on these topics. I'm just presenting these concepts to you with the latest research. Be sure to check out these resources that I'm giving you on this slide and the following slide for a more in-depth look at these topics. So my hope is that you learned a little bit about compression garments and blood flow restriction today, and also that you've been given the resources necessary to empower yourself to look into these topics further and other topics as well. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.